16th, 1991. And we're in the back bedroom of Fort Tecumseh outside of Graham, Washington. And these are three pictures that were taken by someone of me as I grew up. This first one was the pith helmet that my mother brought back from Indian Head in Ontario as she visited one summer. And I was wearing it with pleasure. It was taken on the lawn of my Uncle Con, the physician's home in South Natchez Avenue. This picture is showing myself with Shamrock, our pet Llewellyn setter, who was my great playmate. We had extensive bouts of running and jumping and wrestling and lots of fun. It's taken at the side of Grover Burroughs' home, the husband or the father of Dr. Fred Burroughs, who recently is deceased. And this is a picture of me at Dr. Holland White's home in the backyard, where his youngest son, Robert White, who also became a dentist later on, has passed away with a brain tumor, who was one of my great friends. And we served in the United States Air Force together.
Quick question, Dad. How old do you think you were in this one?
I suspect that I probably was about 4, 5 maybe.
Okay.
And here I'm probably about the same age. I imagine they're all about the same age.
Okay.
Photograph taken of me at the age of 2. The costume of the day for young Canadian children was of this description, with a semi-blouse and skirt, and with really knee-high socks. I think it was taken at the insistence of my grandmother while I was visiting them in Montreal one summer. I guess the first summer I was there.
A little about your family, since you said Canadian.
Well, we should divide it up into Canadian and American, or United States citizens. My mother was Canadian, born in Belleville, Ontario, to Edward and Donald, and his wife, I can't remember her name, she was a character. She was able to get railroad passes all over the United States and Canada, because my grandfather was the head land and tax commissioner for the Grand Trunk and Grand Trunk Pacific Railway. So there was always some party between the various railroads throughout the continent. She had a list of several notebooks filled with these passes, and she could go any place, and she did. She loved to travel, and she was a very interesting person. Her name was Ada. Her name was Ada Gillen before she was married. And the Gillen family go way back to the UE Royalists that I think settled someplace in either New Jersey or New York, as far as we can gather. Her mother was a Mitchell, and they were also UE Royalists, but they came from the Nova Scotia area, as I
I've got to
understand.
ask, what's a UE Royalist?
So that's a UE Royalist is loyal to the royal family of England.
Oh. Well,
Moved to Canada at the time of the
They moved
Revolution.
to Canada from the United States, or from the colonies actually, to Canada, to the Canadian area. The grandfather, Donald, was a very capable person. He wasn't much more than 5'2". He was a great athlete for his day. He helped organize some of the first board operations of the Montreal Athletic Association, and was a life member. Even when I went to medical school there, starting in 1934 and graduating in 1939, I was given the privilege as his grandson to participate at the Montreal Athletic Association, both on the grounds in Westmount as well as at the club house, where we played squash and badminton, and we were allowed to swim in the swimming pool, and of course have the waiters and the servants wait on us as sniffling medical students and drinking beer.
Sounds great.
And grandfather was stone deaf, and he became deaf about the age of 30 by diving off the yardarms of the large sailing vessels that came into the Bay of Quinte off of Lake Ontario while they picked up lumber and such goods for export all over the world. He always carried an ear trumpet in those days. We had none of the electronic materials, and this ear trumpet had a stationary piece that he would put in his ear, and then had a little funnel at the other end of the tube, and he spoke into that. He was extremely interested in some of the first radios, and one of the first ones that I ever saw was in Atwater, Kent. And he bought as much of the material as he could afford and could lay his hands on, and he became quite an expert in amateur radio at the time in Montreal, because he was then stationed in the headquarters of the Grand Trunk Railroad.
Where did the Grand Trunk run?
Well, the Grand Trunk ran actually through Vermont and Maine and into the 5 lower provinces of Canada along the lower ends of the St. Lawrence River.
So the maritime?
The maritime area. Also in Quebec and Ontario. And then it was decided by some of the stockholders who lived in England that they should open up the Western Territories because of the mining and the gold and the lumber industries and this type of thing. And so they formed a separate company under the auspices of the Grand Trunk to call the Grand Trunk Pacific. And that's when grandfather would start out claiming land. He was always very interesting to get on his private car, and I would go out to the West Coast with him, and in the daytime we would be out in the observation car looking at properties that he had bought for the railroad. He always felt it was a great mistake that they had expanded to that length, and it did eventually break the railroad because there were so many hundreds of miles to keep in operation.
So was he buying property all the way to BC?
To BC, yes. And all the properties that had to be bought had to pass through his hands because he was the chief lawyer. He actually convinced the Grand Trunk Pacific Railroads to buy properties which are now known as Jasper National Park. And that was his very great love to see that be developed. And before he passed away, they had started the original lodge there. And he had the opportunity of being one of the honored guests when they opened the lodge. He passed away in 1922 or 23. Grandma Donald would come out about every 2 years to visit us, and she would come by railroad, and she had everybody on the train well organized. She knew everyone, and when she hit town, Mother would say to her bridge club and to the people at the country club that her mother was coming, and they would say, "When is Ada hitting town?" And as soon as Ada hit town, our house became a whirlwind of a depot kind of nature, people coming in and out. She was a great conversationalist and used to have a tremendous amount of fun. And Dad, of course, at that time was a great sport. He played golf, both left-handed and right-handed. I think he spent more time on the golf course than he did in business, but he was very lucky and fortunate he was able to do quite well in the produce business. And so he and grandmother would have a little snops in the early evening, and I can remember as a child, about 7 or 8 years of age, of people coming in and the uproarious parties, and I'm sure a number of little jokes and so forth that were told. Whatnot. My mother was out in the kitchen slaving, trying to feed these people who were coming in, and she said she would be glad to see her mother go by the time she'd been there about a week.
I bet. Now, where was your grandmother living at that point? Still in Montreal?
She was still living in Montreal at 7274 Dorchester, right across the street from the famous Dr. Archibald, who He was the chief of surgery at the Royal Victoria. That's how I got to know Dr. Archibald. And got some little special things in my 5th year
How
in
nice.
surgery. So all these things counted up, knowing some of the family friends and stuff like that. I spent a number of, 3, I think, summers of lengths of months to 6 weeks at a time in Belleville, Ontario, where the family had originated. I used to stay with my grand uncle, who was the postmaster, and his wife was one of my dearest friends, Aunt Theda. She had 2 youngsters. One is still living as an artist in the lower parts of New York. Has put out a number of books.
What's your name?
And his name was Michael Gillen. And then his sister, who was a bit older, married Phil Waters. He was the chief gardener for the Dominion of Canada and was stationed in Ottawa. She still lives there. She's not well. They had 3 youngsters. I get a Christmas card from her every year, and I write to her every year.
So when you say the family had a place in Belleville,
Yeah.
that was your grandmother and grandfather
They
together
started
had a
there.
summer?
No, they didn't. They lived there for a time.
Oh, I see.
See,
Okay.
my grandfather started out as a gandy dancer on the railroad as a youngster going to school. And when he got into academy, which was equivalent to the high school, he became much more interested in finding an occupation.
You know, dandy dancer.
Yeah, gandy dancer, those people who had long poles that they would settle the gravel to put the ties of the rails on. They don't do that anymore, but they used to have whole teams of them, and that's the way he earned his money during the summertime. He went to law school through correspondence because there were very few organized law schools in Canada at the time. He was admitted to the bar. I don't know, I think he was about 36 years of age at that time. And that's when he began to get into the assessment business of the properties of the Grand Trunk, as I understand it. I'm not definitely sure of all the dates, but this was approximately what happened. I visited him the last time I saw him in Montreal in 1921, as I recall. He had his own office. He had his own secretaries and 2 or 3 underlings. And when I came into the office by myself and asked to see Mr. Donald, this woman who was about 6 foot tall, according to my standards at the time, peered over the desk and wanted to know why I wanted to see Mr. Donald. He was a busy man. I said, well, he happens to be my grandfather. Oh, she said, you are Edward Donald. And I said, yes, I'm Edward Donald Lynch. And that's how my name was. And he had a beautiful office. He wasn't doing very much at the time. He was a little ancient at the time, but they kept him. He was a walking historian for the railroad, and things that had not been put down in writing or could be reproducible, the lawyers in other areas of the railroad would call him about certain things, and he could almost verbatim tell them the date and the time and what was going on at the time and who they bought the property from. He had a fantastic memory.
You have a little hand over there. That's waving.
Waving.
Yes. So where did your mother grow up?
Well, my mother grew up in Belleville, and she went to Queens. She graduated from the academy in Belleville, as I understand it. Then she went on to Queens University in Kingston. At that time, grandfather and grandmother were living in Kingston because it was one of the big division heads of the Grand Trunk Pacific, and it was coming up through the ranks of the company at the time. And she finished the 4-year course of foreign language and literature in 3 years, and she was the youngest person at that time who received the Victoria Medal for being highest in her class and also the so-called valedictorian. She should have gone into business, but in those days, young ladies who were members of the higher class of the white people and Canadians were not thought to be business women. She would have been very good because she was a great banker, which I learned later on. She was the one that was able to find the money for me to go to medical school. So that was, she had one sister. Her younger brother, Douglas, was killed by saboteurs at the hydroelectric plant in the First World War.
Mm.
He was chief spokes engineer for keeping the hydro plants going, and to do for producing the electricity.
I think there are fireworks. Well, let's.
Nice looking room.
Uncle Douglas, who was a graduate of McGill University in electrical engineering, was the troubleshooting engineer for the hydroelectric plants at Niagara Falls. And one noon, one of his maintenance men reported to us and felt that there was something wrong with one of the turbines. They went up to investigate it. Both were electrocuted, and the Canadian government investigating that problem, because it was during wartime, definitely proved that there was sabotage and that they had planted some irregular circuitry in the switchboard, and this is what killed the two men. Mother had one older sister, Jean, who married Guy Bell, who was a very successful bank manager for the Bank of Montreal, and was sent to various places in Ontario, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, for the reason that some of the bank branches were not doing well, and he would go in there and bring up the business. He and my father were great friends, and they used to get into all kinds of tricks and to play on people. They loved to play golf and then come home and brag about their scores. So that pretty much tells the story. Aunt Jean and Uncle Guy had two sons. Charlie still lives in Regina, Saskatchewan. We talk on the phone once in a while, and we exchange cards. Douglas was killed in an automobile accident at the age of 19 or 20. Charlie served with the Canadian Navy during the Second World War, and had some rather harrowing experiences chasing German submarines in the North Atlantic in his tour of duty in the open sea.
Now let me ask, who was the Aunt Jean we used to meet in New York?
Oh, the Aunt Jean that we used to meet was my grand aunt. She was George Donald's daughter. Aunt May was my grand aunt. They were her children. She had Alan, Jessie Mary, Jean, and Remsen. Remsen was married to the daughter of the executive chief of General Foods, had lots of money. Aunt May was quite well off after Uncle George passed away in Yakima in 1917, and she immediately took her family back east because she came from New Jersey.
Okay, now is this on your dad's side?
This is on my mother's side.
On your mother's side.
Yeah. And Aunt Jean was a assistant curator of the museums of natural art in New York for many years.
Natural history?
Natural history on Fifth Avenue, up about 82nd or 3rd in that area, right off of the Grand Central Park.
Well, she used to live in Yonkers, right?
No, she lived in New York.
Oh, okay.
Proper, yeah.
Okay.
The Aunt Jean Vance, was my great aunt, who was the sister of my grandfather, and she married George Vance, an engineer. He was the chief engineer on the building of the railroads coming out of Yakima, going to Tieton, Cowiche, Natchez, Moxie, and part of it to the upper parts of the lower valley near Fort Simcoe and White Swan.
Okay, now was this on your mom's side
This is
too?
still on my mother's side, yes.
How did all these people from
Well,
Montreal
it's very
kind of
interesting
get
that
out?
my father took over the ranch up in the Attanum, and they had a hop ranch. And it was his job to, after he graduated from WAC, which was Washington Agricultural College, in 1901, to market the hops that they had. And he would travel to the various brewery interests to the upper states, like in Minnesota and Chicago and into Montreal. And he met my mother when she came out west to visit her Uncle George at his new home, which is now the Women's Century Club on North 2nd Street. And that's how they struck up an acquaintance. And Dad said he found all the excuses he could each fall to go back and visit Montreal in his tours of the various breweries back there. And he sold most of his hops to Molson and Frontenac.
Don, what's the picture?
The picture is one that's a steel engraving. It was done by Aunt Jean. She was quite a talented artist. She had several private showings in Regina, Saskatchewan.
Show it to me.
And it was this was a copy of one of them that she presented to my mother as a gift at one time. I don't know, sometime in the early 40s. Her son, Charlie, who's still alive, was a very interesting individual insofar as that he was CEO of the Regina Leader newspaper, the leading newspaper in the province of Saskatchewan. He retired from that post after some 40 years of service. He did steel work similar to this picture. Most of them of his were characterizations of people that he saw on the street or had met at some of the places. I wish I had the original copies of some that he sent to me, but they were lost. I don't know where they disappeared to. So that pretty well solves my
Mother's side of the
side
family.
of the family.
And I think we're just about out of date.
Yeah.
Okay, so next tape we'll take your dad's side of the family. Good enough. Okay, Dad, we're
on
rolling.
picture now.
So
I
it's
wondered
the 9th of
did you
August.
press the red button too for
I pressed the red button. Yes,
I wonder if it's recording as far as sound is concerned.
we're going to have to guess.
Yes, on that, eh? It wouldn't be much value just to take the pictures.
Well,
Did you press the red one after you put the power on?
yeah, it's
Okay, that's
recording
all you
right
have to
now.
do. Okay. So we are starting this tape on August the 9th, 1991. At our condominium in Summit View Country Condominium Association, and we're in Unit 2B. And we want to talk about the Lynch side of the family, and as much as we can find out about where they arrived from or where they originated. My grandfather was born in County Cork in England. I'm not sure how old he was. He was raised as an artisan, became an expert cabinet maker. He was very much against the British government and the people who were attempting to force all types of rules and regulations on the Irish people, particularly in Southern Ireland. He felt that Cromwell was the curse of the earth, and he felt that any country that was flying the Union Jack was a masterpiece of trickery. As my father said, he took he and my grandmother to the Northwest Expedition in Seattle in 1904 or 5, I believe. It was a beautiful sunny day in the summertime. They arrived at the grounds, which near the now University of Washington. And as they got out of the cab, which became a horse-driven cab, as I understand, there was enough of a shadow so that there was something that was making a flapping noise and also a moving, dancing shadow on the pavement. And he looked up, and it was the Union Jack. And he had a shillelagh or a cane with him, and he took it up and shook it at the flag and said he would refuse to go into any area that flew the Union Jack. And with all the persuasion and coaxing, he refused to go into the exhibit or have anything to do with it. He demanded to be taken back to his hotel.
Oh my. Well done.
Yeah, he was so much against the British rule that he did escape from the guards and the export people and got on the packet going to the New World and landed in Brooklyn, New York. Sometime in the late 1860s, as I understand, he got a job as a cabinet maker for the Great Eastern, which was the vessel that laid the first cable from North American continent to the European continent. He then returned to Ireland, and having known my grandmother for some time, who my father said was part of the Irish royalty in County Cork, he convinced her that living was better in the New World, and they then escaped out of southern Ireland under the eyes of the British and sailed for Brooklyn again.
Dad, what was your grandmother's last name?
Her grandmother's last name was McCarthy, capital M-C, capital C-A-T-H-E-Y, as I understand it. Dad felt that had some stipulation as being a so-called Irish royal family. There are many ways of spelling McCarthy, but this is the so-called genteel way of doing it. They were married in Brooklyn. They had a number of youngsters. The only one that I knew was Lawrence, who was named after his father, as my grandfather was named Timothy L. Lynch, or Timothy Lawrence Lynch. And so Uncle Tim, my uncle, my father's oldest brother living, was named Tim, and everybody called him Tim. The boat-making industry in that area did subside because it was at the time of a lull in world traffic. It was also at the time of the potato famine in Ireland. My grandfather felt that he might be able to do better, hearing that there were many things going over on the west coast of the then North American continent. He took a sailing packet from Brooklyn and went down to the southern pole of South America around the Cape of Good Hope, and then landed in the Bay of San Francisco at the Oakland Estuary. They spent, I don't know how many months there. He felt that it would be a land of opportunity. He had run into a person who wanted to sell a farm. Now, whether it was at this time, his first visit to the San Francisco Bay Area, I'm not definitely sure. One of the convincing things about staying in that area was that the United States government, Army, had decided to put a West Coast armory, supply depot in either the Oakland Estuary, which is on the east side of the bay, or on the peninsula, which is now known as the area of San Francisco. Whichever time he did buy this piece of property, which consisted of between 14 and 17 acres in what is now known as downtown San Francisco, I'm not definitely sure. However, he then returned to Brooklyn by way of a sailing packet to Panama and crossed the Panama Isthmus of Panama on foot and caught another packet out of the east coast area of the isthmus and came back to Brooklyn. He convinced my grandmother that this was the place to go, so they packed up all the world's goods, including several youngsters. I don't know how many. Several had died in early infancy. I think when they left, Uncle Tim and an older daughter by the name of Kate and an older daughter by the name of Margaret were in a party, and they then sailed down to the Isthmus of Panama, and by the time that they got there, the railroad had been built across the isthmus, and they took that. However, like all pioneers, they ran into a lot of difficulty there because of yellow fever and all the things, their worldly goods except their clothing on their back and a few other odds and ends, were burned because of the spread or the inability to know how yellow fever was spread, and everything that they owned went up in flames. This was the normal routine. They finally reached San Francisco Bay. How long it took them, no one seems to know. They did settle on the peninsula of San Francisco and started farming. The problem of whether the United States government would put their large supply depot in Oakland or in San Francisco was finally decided, and Oakland got the bid, and therefore the peninsula of San Francisco was pretty much a pastoral land, and my grandfather felt that it was not going to do very much, and therefore one night in what is now known as the famous North End, he sold his farm with a few head of cattle and whatnot on it to a person who I don't know the name. I did it one time for a piece of property in the territory, the Northwest Territory, which later became the state of Washington, in the valley of the Yakima River and the southern tributary of the Yakima River known as the Tanum Valley. I believe, although I'm not sure, that the priest had established a post in the Tanum Valley, and that interested him, as both he and my grandmother were staunch Catholics. They arrived, our grandfather went first, and he came into this part of the country, having landed in the Grays Harbor area on a lumber packet or a sailing vessel, and by over foot he came into the valley and looked at the properties and to find out whether it was worthwhile and whether the cattle that he had also bought in the transaction, which he was sold as having some cattle on it, 35 head of cattle supposedly. He then proceeded to the junction of the Snake and Columbia rivers, where he met his first cousin, John J. Lynch, who had just recently been discharged from the 13th U.S. Cavalry, having spent some 13 or 14 years riding the plains of the United States, as it was known in those days. Uncle John had a band of horses that was given to him as a bonus because of spending so many years in the cavalry, and they were all remount horses that had come from some place in the center part of the United States where the government had set up this improvement area for the native horses and crossbred them with other species of horse flesh so that they would be more hardy and larger and would withstand the rigors of the plains as well as the mountains. The band of horses got away from them one night, and the river was so low in the last of August or 1st of September that they were able to wade across the Columbia River and get over onto the now known Eastern Oregon bank, and it took them a few weeks to get as many horses back to put them in the band. Now, what happened to the actual band of horses, I was never able to find out from my father. Grandfather then returned to Grays Harbor area on foot and sailed back to San Francisco, and then brought back the family in 1972. Prior to that, when he, or 1872, I'm sorry,
Oh,
he had
okay.
gone to the government office, patent office, which was then in Walla Walla area near the Quitman Mission, to register his right of claim and deed to the properties and show that he paid money for it. As I understand it, the deed was destroyed when the Indians destroyed the mission there, but I'm not definitely sure of that. It was in the hearsay. However, they returned with the whole family and ended up in a place called Priel. And this is where my father was born. Now, there were two other brothers that were born in San Francisco, as I understand it, and that was Cornelius Joseph Lynch and John Joseph Lynch. And my father was born in Priel in 1878, I recall. He was 6 months of age when they brought him overland into the valley. At that time, my grandfather had proceeded with the family and set up a sod hut in which they lived, and had convinced the neighbors and several of them, the Mondors and the Herkies, to join him in the venture of setting up a water-driven power saw meant to get raw lumber to build homes, which he eventually did. The home is still there. All the gingerbread that's on the eaves and much of the fancy cabinet work was done by his grandfather. He had two fairly good-sized steamer trunks made of leather in which he carried all these particular tools. Uncle John, the lawyer, got all those tools. I did get two wood-block planes, and where they disappeared to I do not know, because while I was in the East Coast, my family moved from their home, which I'll discuss later, and I have never seen those planes since that time. They were made of wood, they were fancily done, and of course the cutting blades were tempered iron with a steel so-called cutting blade. The family grew up on the Lynch Ranch, and interestingly enough, across the main branch of the Tanum Creek was a John Lynch, who was no relative of my grandfather. He had started to homestead that area. I think he had approximately 360 acres. There was some discussion. My father felt that his father had only gotten 158 acres, but apparently he had another 100 and some acres up on the side hill, which he eventually sold to some people who are still there because he couldn't farm it. They had something like 15 to 25 or 23 acres of hops. They got the roots from someplace, I think from some of the French Canadians that were settling in the Moxie area. My grandfather had toyed with the idea of moving the whole clan into the Moxie area, but gave it up because he felt there wasn't enough water supply. Little did he know that with the Treaty of 1855, that it would cut off the water supply of the Tanum Creek when it got to a certain level during the summertime, and the farm eventually was sold, even though Uncle Con, who was then a practicing physician, and my father, who was a produce man, although he was a graduate mining engineer from Washington Agricultural College, attempted to drill several wells that turned out to be dry. They felt that it was useless to try to do much farming. So they sold it to somebody in piecemeal. I don't know who they were. So from there, my father, who was the youngest of the whole tribe used to be the only one left because Uncle Con went to John Hopkins, actually went to St. Louis University Medical School for 4 years to receive his medical degree. He did get his undergraduate degree at the normal school in Ellensburg, as I understand it. He then spent at least a year, maybe two, at John Hopkins doing research work, because I always felt it was very valuable. He brought with him a flock of guinea pigs who had been inoculated with tuberculosis, and they were building up antibodies, which turned out to be one of the first evidences of typhoid fever vaccine was produced in the valley. And Uncle Con made this vaccine. He was ridiculed and was almost run out of town because he was practicing witchcraft from some of the old physicians, but he was able to prove that those people who received the vaccine were immune to typhoid, because the valley was known as Typhoid Alley.
Really?
And one of the first groups of public health by the United States government, as well as the local government and the state government, got behind this and made one of the first public health districts in the valley of Yakima to try to prevent the spread of typhoid, which
Why
is
do you
a sideline.
Why was typhoid so prevalent?
Because it had been brought in by the settlers, and the fecal material eventually ended up in the watershed, and the people drank the water downstream. So this was the reason it was spread, because the contaminant materials in the water supply were the common places in which typhoid is spread. But you don't see much typhoid anymore. I don't think any of the present-day physicians would recognize typhoid. I had had some experience with it while I was going to medical school in Montreal, Canada. Probably was one of the last physicians in Yakima who diagnosed a so-called paratyphoid B in a small infant when I was doing pediatrics in the late 50s. It's rather interesting. Going on, my father ran the ranch and all the rest moved out. Timothy L. became a produce broker. CJ, of course, went to medical school and finally came back to the valley and set up practice in 1904. John, who was the favorite of my grandmother, Lynch, the fair-haired boy, he was the beauty of the group, went to University of Michigan to get a legal degree and came back here to practice law and became the famous police judge John Lynch, who was asked to retire after his second tour of being elected as police judge. All the boys are now have passed away. Interestingly enough, Kate, who was born, I think, on the East Coast, became a very mature woman when, by the time they had moved into the valley, and she later married John Lynch across the creek and raised Johnny and Mary, who were my second cousins and who I became very, very fond of, and used to spend some of my early days on their ranch. Dad went to the Marx Academy for his undergraduate work. However, he did spend a few years at the preschool in the Atana. After that, he used to ride his horse after hop season, and he had killed the hops and dried them and baled them as best they could in those days. To the normal school in Ellensburg, and spent 3 years there and received his high school equivalent education and was qualified to attend the newly established Washington Agricultural College in Pullman, Washington. He spent 3 years there and received a graduate degree in mining engineering. He got a job as a mill superintendent in Nevada, in Ely, I think it was. He graduated from WAC in 1901. The silver scare in 1907 was non-profitable for the silver miners in the Rocky Mountain regions, and the mills closed down, and he lost his job, and he came back to Yakima not knowing what to do. He joined Timothy in what was known as the Lynch Taylor Produce Company, and became a buyer and also an exporter of potatoes and onions and some fruit. How long he was there is difficult to say. I was born in Yakima in the old Nichols house on North 11th Avenue. I think it's number 12 or 13, I've forgotten. It's on the corner of the northwest corner of North 11th Avenue at A Street. My mother was toxic a good deal of the time of eclampsia. Uncle Con, who attended her, was very frightened that neither one of us would live. However, I guess good English, I'm a good Irish Scotch stock, in which my mother was part Irish and part Scotch, and we all survived. I was the only child. They were, as a couple, Pat and Helen, and mother, who I'll discuss later, were forbidden, so to speak, by Uncle Con and the physicians of that day to ever attempt to have pregnancy again because of the possibility of kidney failure and things of that nature, which was quite unknown in those days. We lived in the Nichols house until I was 4 and a half, and my father bought a home on what is known as Terrace Avenue, or the address was actually 1212 West Yakima Avenue. They lived there until 1959, 58. And they moved from there to 2603 West Walnut in a smaller home. The home that I grew up in was a 3-story house that had been built by a construction engineer. He had thought he would make apartments for it. The house was divided by a central hallway. It was not only plumbed for gas, but it was also plumbed for electricity. It was quite modern in its day. It was built in, I think, 1909. It was quite roomy. We had lots of fun there. My father was a very busy person. He eventually gained enough expertise and enough control of his business that he did quite well. He bought 2 or 3 small warehouses on Fruit Row and was comfortably off. He had some exposure to some of his friends in the mining business in British Columbia, and they had convinced him that they had a proposition that was unbeatable in the Imperial Valley of California in raising early vegetables such as lettuce and cauliflower and whatnot. And since he knew something about doing ditching and grading and that type of thing from his engineering part of view, they convinced him that this was the place to go. He sold out all his deals, except fortunately he didn't sell the home on Yakima Avenue. And we were then moved from Yakima in 1920 to, first of all, Los Angeles, and we lived on 7th Avenue in Flower, where they used to take a lot of moving pictures, because on the 4 corners were the so-called large apartments, which consisted of 10 or 12 stories, and it looked like a metropolitan area. And that's where I got my first indication of how fakey motion pictures could be. I went to school there. I was ahead of most of them when I got there, and I was transferred from the 2nd grade to the 3rd grade. I was part of the year, and my mother felt that it was getting a little too difficult to control my exuberant expectations of life because there was only the street to play on. And she convinced my father to move to Santa Monica, and we rented an apartment there that was right on the beach. And I finished my school year there, going to school there. We were there a year, and the spring of that year we were there with the most heavy frost I'd ever witnessed, and wiped out all the plantings that this group of men and my father were involved in. So we came home broke in the early summer of 1921. I never forget the day that I went with my father, because he didn't know exactly how to get involved again, because things had changed a little bit, and they did, because the produce business was growing very rapidly in the valley. He went to talk to several people, and we finally ended up with a man who was superintending a building on Fruit Row, and he turned out to be Fred Platt Sr., and he and a fellow by the name of not Peacock, Pickrell, I think it was, were involved in what is known as the Washington Fruit Company, and he tried to convince my father, rather than Platt, to join them, since he had experience in estimating crops and tonnage and his engineering background. And after a few days and a week or so, I guess, of pros and cons, I was too young to know the details, he did join the then Washington Fruit and Produce Company, because my father said they could also run potatoes and onions and this type of thing. And so that started a partnership. They bought out the other partner, who was a little older than they and wanted to retire family anyway. So that started that relationship, and went along until my father retired in 1942, I think. I was not here. I was in Iceland with the United States Air Force at the time. I went to school at the Roosevelt grade school. Interestingly enough, it was a brick building, but it had squeaky floors, and you couldn't sneak out in between classes, because anybody that knew anything about the building knew where you were from the squeaks in the floor. It has been pulled down and been rebuilt, and at the present time the second building that was replaced is now being torn down, and a brand new school is being placed there in the same area, North 16th Avenue at Summit View. At the time I went to school, Summit View stopped. It didn't go any further west than 16th Avenue. The Yakima Tennis Club was kitty corner from the school. There was a bakery called Thompson's Bakery across the street of North 16th Avenue. And there was a small grocery store where several stores have been in since that time. The streetcar went up a little further than 16th Avenue. I'm not sure exactly, maybe up to 20th, but it was in the coulees and the brush, and then at that time. But it was one of the public transportations in which I rode as a youngster down to Mrs. Scudder's kindergarten on North 4th Avenue, North 4th Street, I should say, just off the avenue. One year, that was an experience, and I enjoyed and did not enjoy, because being rather small for my age, I was pretty much picked on by the bigger boys, and I sometimes was threatened if I didn't go to school that I would have to stay indoors. So with the lesser of the two, I went to kindergarten. I did also join the YMCA when I was about 8 years of age, and learned how to play marbles and cheat just as well as the rest of the guys, because it was down on the east side. It was on 4th Street on the south side, where there is now a parking area just behind Nordstrom's building, closing. graduated from grade school, I was told that there were no bounds, so that I could do all kinds of things. As my wife now says, I have a loose tongue. I was able to get up before the class and display lots of English language, good, bad, and indifferent. I described numerous trips that my grandfather and my mother and I took to eastern Canada, Montreal, Belleville, Ontario, and several summers that I had spent sailing on the Bay of Quinte, which is a body of water off of the Lake Ontario. There I met probably some of my best friends in my my family. They were Uncle Alf and Aunt Thea Gillen, Uncle Alf was my grandmother, my maternal grandmother's brother. He was the postmaster, and I used to spend many delightful Christmases there when I was attending medical school in Montreal.
So he lived in Belleville?
He lived in Belleville, Ontario.
Mm-hmm.
Aunt Theda was probably as much a mother to me as anybody I knew in my family. And up until recently, I've kept contact with her one remaining child that I could talk to, and that was Barbara Waters, who married Phil, who was probably the best-known horticultural gardener in the Dominion of Canada, as he ran the botanical gardens for the federal Canadian government in Ottawa. Michael is still alive, but Mike and I got to know each other too well. He was still an artist in New York and living in the artist colonies in the lower Manhattan area. So it has for a number of years.
And his last name is Gillen?
His last name is Gillen. He's had several books out, but his name as not only a cartoonist drawing these things. I don't know how well they are. I've never seen any on the shelves of our local stores at all, but I guess he had quite a large circulation for a while on the East Coast. Well, back to going to high school, I had learned to play a little bit of basketball, which became my great love, in the basement of the old Summit View Grade School, which was, I think, about as high as 8 feet, and lots of tubing and pipes and so forth. So it was a lot of difficult to learn much about it, but that's where I learned to bounce the ball. I convinced my father that when we built a new garage in the back of the house in 1212 West Yakima to get a hoop for Christmas and also basketball, and so it became the gathering spot for all the youngsters around the neighborhood. Since we were burning coal in our fireplace, our furnace, which was a central heater in the basement, it was my job as best I could to lug out the ashes. And since I probably weighed dripping wet, maybe 85 or 90 pounds, with that, and the buckets would carry about 50 pounds of ashes, it was rather difficult. I just have to throw them out there, but where there's a will, there's a way to get a foundation for a basketball court in the alley. We had some difficulty with a Dr. Brown across the alleyway, who was a dentist. He was pretty much didn't like young people. He didn't have any children, and it was quite a contest when once in a while the basketball would wander into his backyard, and I would have to very delicately ask Mrs. Brown if I could go in and retrieve it when Dr. Brown was not home. Well, that continued on into high school, and among my great friends, we played 4 years of basketball and 3 years on the varsity team, and 3 years on the track team, and my last year in high school I was the football senior manager, and so I went to school to play sports and indirectly got a diploma in high school. So I learned my ABCs and my English language, and I took 2 years of German and 2 years of French in high school. No chemistry, strangely enough. 4 years of mathematics and 4 years of Latin, which had to be tossed in between playing basketball and running in track. And so if I'm going to brag a little bit, I was my last year was named as the best second team forward in the league in the Valley at high school as a guard, even though I was only barely 5'6" in those days. It was interesting. It was a lot of fun, and I learned a lot because I was an only child. I then proceeded to go to Washington State College, which was my father's alma matter, but that changed it to a state university, an agricultural college. Spent 4 long years in the Toulouse country. I became one of the first pre-med students under Dean Webster in that department as newly organized. I had some rather difficult times in that area. It was just at the time in which the crash came in 29 as I graduated in the class of 1930. And we had a full pledge class in Beta Theta Pi, Gamma Theta chapter that first year, but the second year it had thinned out to where I think there were 5 of us out of a pledge class of 31 that were living in the house. It was pretty difficult to keep going and keeping a large fraternity house going, but we managed. My last 2 years I was the only senior upperclassman in there, living in the fraternity. However, I joined a secret fraternity, as I should, to represent the fraternity row. I got into a lot of difficulty with that, had some great fun. I didn't get across to the dean, however. He never did catch me doing anything wrong, supposedly. I did have to go and plead my case to President Holland, and my father came with me because in February of 1931, being a freshman, and I was trying out for track, and incidentally I got a complimentary visitation scholarship in which I got some break in my school's books because of it. I had become a track star at that time in the low hurdles, being as short as I was. Everybody ran 7 steps between the hurdles. I ran 8, and I had to alternate. And we all set new records for that year, and I was sandwiched in between 2 long-legged giants. One of them was Ron Kelly, who became a great friend of mine, and finally became the commander of this district in the Washington State Patrol. He and I always remained friends. He won the race that time, I don't know, by a nose, I guess, and then the previous champion, the fellow from Walla Walla, who'd won 2 previous years before, and it took me something like 20 to 25 minutes to decide who had really won and who wasn't, and since I was the smallest, they gave me 3rd place. I'm not sure because at the 9th hurdle, I found no one ahead of me and no one behind me, and I looked around and I misstepped and I almost fell, but they caught up to me on the 10th hurdle. Otherwise, I'd have been way ahead of them. Anyway, I did set a record for the low hurdles in the valley that year. My great friend Robert Green White, who turned out to be a dentist, broke the record the next year. With my help, because I was out of school because I had a severe burn when I got a Charlie horse and pulled a muscle. And couldn't go back to school for 2 or 3 months. And I lost 1 grade or half grade, and they were going to throw me out of school because I didn't have enough credits. And when we explained it to the president, he said we were very sorry what had happened, and also at the same time we along with several other students in my class the second year, put the cowbells on the professor, not the professor, assistant professor of chemistry, because he was a different individual, and he allowed his young boyfriend that he was being quite intimate with good grades, and the rest of us had struggled for C and D. He couldn't approach any of us. That was rather interesting. I spent a good deal of time in the library in my last 2 years because I had finished up all my prerequisites for medical school, with the exception of getting another year in either German or French, which was required by the University of Oregon Medical School, and when I applied there, they turned me down. I didn't want to go there anyway.
finally received a bid from McGill University. They had been investigating my past because I had, in the middle of the herd grades, I had had some bad reports because of my difficulty with my right leg being burned and missing part of the chemistry school and whatnot. Also, my professor of history, Dr. Deutsch, refused to endorse me from his school, which is the University of Michigan, and because he wanted me as a stack boy in history, which I dearly loved, and spent, I had something like 16 and a half hours of credit, which I should have had 17 for a teaching minor, which was always and still is very interesting to me.
Yeah, let me just walk back for a moment. Now, I missed the part. You got in trouble
during my first year in in undergraduate school at WSU, because I couldn't attend class. I couldn't stand on my leg because it was burnt. I got an infection. I got septicemia, and I had a big abscess in the back of my neck. And Uncle Con lanced it, and I never forget his nurse when he opened it, and she looked at me, Miss Purcell. She was as big as a house, that had beautiful hands of a healing angel. She said, "Don, you're rotten." I never forget that. They took a culture and made a vaccine, and that's how I became interested in possibly going into medicine, but that was my first year in college. Anyway, while I was trying to decide what I was going to take in college, I was studying for my final exams in my last year in high school. It was summer or early June. Uncle Con and his son, Herbert C. Lynch, came up to visit, and they said to my family, "We'd like to talk to Donald to see what he's going to do in college." And I was in the dining room, and at the dining room table where I studied. And so they came in and shut all the doors, and I thought, what have I done now? But it turned out that they wanted to find out if I would be interested in taking pre-medics, because that was the time in which the universities and the colleges were beginning to groom young people to go into the field of medicine. So I said, well, I was going to go into engineering, probably electrical engineering or mechanical engineering, but I said I would entertain the idea, and by the time I got to Pullman, they had already established the department of pre-medics under the zoology department, and that's how I got hooked into it. And it was enjoyable. However, as you probably know, the winters of Pullman are not the best desired. We had lots of fun. We won the Pacific Coast Championship in football that year, my first year, and it was the Trojan horse that we had to find and get an old pony and bring it into the house and hide it from the Sigma News and the Deltas and the Peaks so they wouldn't steal it. We had quite a barnyard in our dining room area, and we all got hacks for that, but we got it out, and we won one of the prizes for having a live exhibition of the Trojan horse that year. We also learned how to make bathtub gin out of grain alcohol, which Tommy Matthews, who was in my class, had sneaked out of the pharmacy his father ran in a large city in the state of Washington. But all in all, we had lots of fun, and we really enjoyed it. But my final year, which was my year that I stayed because I got the inside track of getting the senior managership, having spent 3 years being a junior manager. And we had a lousy team, but we had a lot of fun. We had a huge center. He was only 7'2". His name was Houston, and every time we'd come out of a place on a trip, it invariably turned out, and he would look around and see who was going to walk with him, and he'd spot me, and he'd say, "Get away from me, manage." You know, I was 5'6", and he was 7'2", so there was a difference. However, he became very handy because they were putting on nickels on the restroom doors, and he could reach over and undo the doors without paid the nickel. And so we used him very happily for that. It was fun. We had lots of fun. That was the year of the big flood in the valley, 32 and 33, and we had to walk the railroad tracks to get home for Christmas. And I spent a night and had to be back on the train to Pullman because we had a road trip into Oregon, and varsity team, and we had lots of fun there. We didn't know whether we were going to make it or not. Those are all stories that we could tell and go on forever. During the summers in high school and in college, and I had been introduced into the produce business. I didn't like to work in the orchards, and so I indicated to my father, and he said, "We'll get you a job someplace else and feel that you should be doing some work." So when I was 10, he got me a job repairing old boxes done with the Washington Street produce at 50 cents a day. I was a big man. I could swing a hatchet and make all kinds of noises and whatnot and get as dirty as a pig with a good excuse. The next year I was supposed to be a box maker, and they didn't have a place for making boxes because they threw it out to some professional outfit. But Dad said, "Well, why don't you go see Mike Roach, who was then getting back in business, having gone bankrupt the year before on a very bad year for produce." And I went in to see Mike, and he wasn't any bigger than I, but he was about 60 years of age, and he looked at me, and he was grizzly faced, and he was a typical Nick Irishman. He said, "You're a Lynch," and I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You want to work?" And I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "I got a job for you, but you're going to have to get a banquet roll, and you're going down to Buena and stay there at the warehouse where we're going to be packing cherries." I went home and told my mother, and she had a fit and started to cry and said, "Well, you're not old enough." I was then the tender age of 11, and I said, "Well, I want to go." I told him I would. And my dad said, "Well, okay, we'll take you down there." And that was my first venture away from home working. And I lived in this packing shed, and in the office where they had built, they didn't have a lock on the door. There was a 2x4 that would go underneath the handle of the doorknob and through a cleat that was hammered into the wooden floor, and that's where I was supposed to stay. And then I would get my meals across the street in an old in and out greasy spoon, and I'm sure that's the first place I tasted horse meat and roast beef. It was an adventure, there's no question about it, and of course the knights of the road were the bums that worked along the railroad, and we were on a railroad siding. When the cherries would come in, and then the soft fruit, like the apricots and peaches, because they came in before the upper part of the valley, we had to pack until we got them into proper shipping crates. The only places we could store them were in the reefer cars, which were the railroad cars. We were iced in Yakima at the Perry Works, and which is derivative of where Mr. J.M. Perry made his fortune with the Northern Pacific Railroad icing cars. He had a storage unit as well for fruit and whatnot. We lived next door to him where we lived on North 11th Avenue, and Mrs. Perry would always remind me to stay away from horses because it was my job as a youngster, 2 and 3 years of age, of going into their barn, sneaking in and swinging on the tail of their old gray horse, who was very gentle to me. Why he didn't kick the brains out of me, I don't know. Anyway, I learned the fruit business from the warehouse side of it. I stayed with Mike for, I don't know, until I was 21, I guess, and worked for him every summer. Learned how to drive a truck when I was 14 and 15, from Buena up to Yakima with no driver's license. There was an old Model A Ford that had a transmission of 17 gears ahead and 13 in the rear. It was called a Waterford transmission. I was shaking my boots all the way, but I made it and didn't get arrested. Of course, in those days you didn't have to have a driver's license and that type of thing. We were then transferred to Zilla that summer and worked there, and then Mike had gotten a loan to open up his warehouse Second Avenue, next door to Whole Center building, and she had a warehouse. I worked there for a number of years. I worked 1 year for cops for my dad and CM Cop, but I didn't like it, and we found out there was something peculiar going on with the packing, and I reported to my father, and I left and got a job with the Washington Food and Produce in my father's place, and made boxes every summer until the age of 22, starting my third year in medical school, and I went to Dad and I said, if I'm ever going to do any surgery and I'm going to keep pounding nails through my little finger while I'm making peach crates or cherry crates and so forth, I don't think it's a very good idea to use. And he said, well, what you're asking for is to not work anymore with Washington Food in that type of business. And I said, that's true. He said, have you got a job? And I said, no, but I'll go find one. So fortunately, Bob White had crashed the Rainier hotel business in Mount Rainier, and they had opened up Sunrise Park, and they had 200 and some cabins as a lodge, and they needed cabin boys to clean. And I got a job up there, and ended my second year in medical school, and became assistant to the nurse who knew a little bit more than I did, but not much. I was a cabin boy for that year, had a lot of fun, met a great fellow by the name of Chip Guilford, and he was the postmaster and also the slicker of the camp, and he was a school teacher and he taught at Yelm. I had been teaching there for 2 years before. And Jack Springer, who became a famous football referee for the Pacific Coast Conference, and he and his wife Judy were the manager and manageress of the lodge there. I worked there 3 years. We had a lot of fun. It was great. Learned a lot how to run a store and how to stamp stamps, as I was a second administrator, postmaster, and I was a camp surgeon, and used to have to go and give the old gals that woke up in the middle of the night because you didn't know they were 6,400 feet up in the air, came from Kansas, and the bus had brought them up over the winding grades during the night, and they woke up the next morning with mountain sickness. And that was the first that I knew they could get mountain sickness, and fortunately I had a few pills of phenobarbital, or pills of phenobarbital, which shouldn't have been given, but they were hysterical. We used to calm them down, we'd get them on the bus and send them down. And in the meantime, at night, while we would get a case of beer, and we'd go up to Whitey's and ride his horses in the corral and have a rodeo. And of course, when all the young ladies would show up, we would have to help them throw around the camp and whatnot. We had a great time. Saturday nights, we had a little band, and I didn't play instruments, but Felix used to sing the songs, and we had a lot of fun. Anyway, I finally graduated from medical school, and people would say, well, how long were you in Montreal? I said, 5 years. Would you lose a grade? And I said, no. All medical students that attended as members of the faculty of medicine at McGill had to attend for 5 years. And they actually passed their final exams their 4th year for their medical degree, Doctor of Medicine, but you were not awarded your Doctor of Medicine until you finished your 5th year, in which you received a Master of Surgery. And I stupidly signed up with a tutor who turned out to be a great guy. He eventually ended up as being the chief surgeon at the Robert Taylor Hospital. Joe Luke, who taught me many, many things about how to organize my work. We had to produce a paper twice a week on a particular part of medicine and surgery, and to describe the technique we would use, and also the parts of the body we were dissecting out and what we were repairing, and that type of thing. And then we had to read them before class of the college or the school year, Phi Beta Kappa, or what they were known as the AOAs. They were the honor students, and I think there were 2 of us that weren't honor students, and we used to take quite a beating because all the rest of them had brains, and we just had guts. But we learned a lot, and I did get my degree. My family came to witness the graduation, and there are a few pictures that we might put in at this time if the camera is still rolling and we can get a fair look at them. And I might present. Are we still on camera?
Mhm.
Still. How about that picture? What does it look like? Is it fairly good? This is a picture. It's rather dark, however, of Patrick Joseph Lynch. He was my father, a graduate of Washington State College in the class of 1901, with a degree in mining engineering. And he was the person who put me through school, with the exception of my grandfather, who had willed my mother, who was Helen Mitchell Donald Lynch. She cashed in a $1,500 bond that he had given to her as a part of the Donald estate after he and his wife Ada Gillen had passed away, which got me through my first year of medical school. And you will see that there is a dog in both pictures, and that is Tarzan. He is a Boston Bulldog, and he was AKC. He was probably the pride and joy of both Pat and Helen, and I used to have a lot of fun with him. He was run over by a car the year before I got home from overseas during the Second World War. There's another picture which I thought I was going to be a movie actor at the time. This was taken when I was 3 years of age, and it was put out and captured by the Bradbury Company, booksellers and stationery, 221 East Yakima Avenue, North Yakima, Washington. And I was in my bib and tucker at that time. This is the things that came from to my grandmother, who lived in Montreal, and this is how young men of that era wore as their principal clothing. Then going further on, I have a lot of pictures that I took of the basketball team and so forth, but they're so hideous, and I'm the youngest one in the group, and had a sour face on me that I decided not to show it on camera. But this is the picture of my father and mother and yours truly after graduation in Montreal, and this was taken in Hudson Heights, which is on the Ottawa River, by Mrs. Edith Lewis, who was a great friend of my grandmother's, who took me in as a wayward soul when I first landed in Montreal as a student going my first year in medical school. She didn't approve of medical students because they were always drinking beer, and so I joined a fraternity, which is Alpha Kappa Kappa, and lived in the fraternity house that year among a lot of heathen medical students, and we had a lot of fun. We also learned a lot from the older students. At the end of that year, Dr. Fairburn and Dr. Grauer, Dr. Fairburn from Tacoma, who was a well-known internist there for many years, and Dr. Grauer, who was a surgeon in Vancouver, British Columbia for many years, drove their car, and I went along with the goat because I was a junior medical student, and we toured the country. We first went to New York and stayed with my Aunt May Donald in her beautiful apartment on Park Avenue. We had butlers and maids and cars to ride around in, and we went to all the hot shots, and we were introduced to all the doormen because you had to have a key to get in, and the doors were locked by 10 o'clock, and of course that meant that we would struggle in about 1 or 2 in the morning. But they condescended if we kept quiet so we could stay. We had a tremendous time, and Aunt May enjoyed us because we were a breath of sunshine. Her family had grown up and pretty much left the nest. We moved from there down to Washington D.C. and Baltimore, and we got lost in the Negro section of Baltimore for almost a day, trying to find our way out, and we finally found a place to stay, which was a little bit, should we say, on the Barney side. And we went into Washington D.C. the next day and had a look at the Smithsonian and the Capitol building and such things, and disappeared that evening into the Cumberland Mountains. And then we finally ended up, the next thing I remember was in St. Louis, where I was driving at noon and went through a caution sign, and I got stopped. I was the driver, and we hadn't heeded the sign that men were working. It was at noon, there was no one working, but the man made us go back to the station house, which was another 12 miles out of our way, and I had to appear before a bailiff. And in the meantime, we had gotten to talk about it because we had a Quebec license on our car, but none of us came from Quebec, and he couldn't quite figure that out. And I said, well, I came from Yakima, Washington. He said, you did? He said, I used to work in the fruit there before I came back here to join the police force. And so when I came before the bailiff, he went up and he said, this gentleman is a friend of mine, and he did a very innocent mistake. It was noontime. The signs that the men were working had not been pulled down because it was at noon and there was no one working. And he did go through there at the regular speed, and he, instead of slowing down, which the sign said he should have, but he was using his brains because he knew that everybody didn't work during the lunch hour. And therefore I say that even though he's gotten a ticket, I don't think he should be fined. He is a student in medicine, and he's touring our country, and the bailiff said, look, Mac, or whatever his name was, are you vouching for this man? He said, yes, sir, he's a great friend of mine. And he said, all right, you're responsible for him. We will put it on the rap sheet, but we will not fine him anything. And that's as close as I've come to being caught by the law. We toured on down to Texas and got into a famous windstorm outside of San Antonio. We almost lost our life that night. Fortunately, we were no place. We'd been out of San Antonio about 50 miles, and it was about 10 o'clock at night, and you could barely see the road. Along came, and we had stalled. This was an Oldsmobile, and they got a vapor lock, which they were known to do, but we knew how to handle it if we could get some cold water and put on the carburetor and dry it out. Two kids came along in a fire-spitting Ford with just two seats in the front and nothing else but a motor and four wheels, and they stopped, fortunately. They were native. They said, you guys are a long ways from any place, but there's a four-corner place that we live about 10 miles down the road, and we'll take you there. And so they hitched onto the Oldsmobile and got it going for us, and we drove into this place. Still the wind going miles an hour in the sand, and they went to a boarding house and told Mrs. So-and-so who ran the boarding house that these guys had been out there and were going to be dead the next day because nobody could stand that wind, and they needed shelter. She said, well, I have 2 rooms left, and you'll have to divide it up. 2 of you got sleep in one bed, and the other one has a single bed, and so the 2 older said they would sleep in a better bed, and I could have the one upstairs in the attic. The wind was so bad, and all the windows were closed. The paper on the walls, wallpaper, had come loose, and it had some bits of plaster on it. And every time there would be a new gust of wind, I would lose 10 to 12 feet of square feet because they would come in and into the bed side, and then when it would subside, then they would go out again. The walls were kind of in an A shape. Anyway, we got something to eat from Ma's Kitchen across the street and enough gas to get us into, was it Albuquerque or Santa Fe? I've forgotten which one. And we stayed there overnight. We were headed for Flagstaff because the 2 older gentlemen that I was traveling with, Fairburn and Brower, had gone to school with a man who was also a great friend of Herbert Lynch, who had been a graduate of McGill. as well as my granduncles in engineering. And practicing in Flagstaff, and that's where we're headed. But in the meantime, we took a side trip out of Santa Fe to see the Pueblo ruins. And it was a rather cloudy, unsettled day. And we didn't know any different. We were up in the canyons and through the riverbeds that were dry. And it started to rain way up in the hills where we were looking at these caves and various things that were there. And on our way back, one of the fords had become a roaring river. And we decided that we'd get a run at it and go through. Well, we got halfway through, and Fairburn, who was the tallest one, had gotten across on the other side, fortunately. But there was a farmer about a quarter of a mile down the road, and he was watching us, and he had his team of horses already hooked up because he'd seen us go up. And with the Doubletree trail, he came up and threw us a rope, and we tied it around the spring housing, and he pulled us out of there. Otherwise, we'd have lost the car, and probably Brower and I would have been down the river. So we got back into Santa Fe and checked out of our motel, and then headed to Flagstaff. We got there in the late afternoon of the following day. Flagstaff is fairly high in the mountains. It started to rain and it started to snow. And this was the end of May. And our friend, I've forgotten his name, he was a big raw-boned Texan, a nice guy, and he said, well, let's go swimming. And we said, you're out of your head. He said, no, we'll get in our cars and we'll go down into the valley. And we went down into one of the valleys, way down, I don't know how many, about 15 miles out of Flagstaff, into a most luscious valley, and it was hot down there. It was about 85 or 90. Beautiful swimming pool, and the man who was running it turned out to be one of the orderlies that had spent, I don't know, 5 or 10 years in the Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal, and he was running this place. And he was so glad to see us, we didn't pay any money to get into the place, and we spent all evening there. The next day we went to Grand Canyon, and then over into Santa Barbara to visit Gene Donald, who was then married to a school teacher in a very private school, a very haunted school in Santa Barbara. And unfortunately, we were pretty well exhausted, and we had a few drinks, and she took us out to some of the nightclubs. And Jean, who was Aunt May's youngest daughter, was a swinger too, and we had a lot of fun, much to the consternation of her husband. And they had not been getting along very well, and they eventually divorced about a year later. But we had a lot of fun. We ended up in San Francisco and went through the Mint and saw them make pennies, etc., and finally ended up in Tacoma. And that was the famous trip.
Sounds wonderful.
So all in all, going to Montreal, and we would travel that way, either by train or by car. And I got a job driving cars from Dearborn back to Yakima. I got to know the roads pretty well for 3 years. And of course, the last year we went from New York and went through the New York World Exhibit, and that's where we saw Mae West, and also. I forgot to tell you my tour of the Chicago World's Fair, in which a priest from Seattle and I took, and we ended up drinking wine from Switzerland, which was beautiful, and we had a lot of fun, but tell you, we got into some trouble there. We ended up at the Great Stevens Hotel, which is the largest hotel in the world, about 1 o'clock in the morning, and a police sergeant saw us, and he was a good Catholic, and he saw the priest with his habit on, and we were not feeling much pain. We were trying to be gentlemen, and he said, gentlemen, what are you doing here, Father, particularly? And he said we were having a good time, and he introduced me to Dr. Lynch, and we were away with him, and he took us into the bar and gave us another drink, and he said, now do you want to see Chicago the way it is? He said, I'm off duty, but I can't change my uniform, show you one of the best homes and houses of not only gambling, but of prostitution and whatnot goes on. And so that you can say that you've seen the rest of Chicago at night. We spent, it was down near the docks, and it was a so-called furniture storage place, which you had to know how to get in. And of course, the sergeant knew how to get in, and he knew how to get the elevator up to the top floor. And we walked into this casino, which was very lush, and everybody was in evening clothes and all this type of thing. We watched them gamble, and we had another drink, and they said, "You want to go down in the second story, the next floor down, and that's where the ladies are." And we said, "No, we're too young for that." And Father said, "Of course we can't go down there." He said, "But we'd like to go through and see their quarters." So we went down with the sergeant and went through that. We didn't taste any of their wares. Then he took us back to the Stevens. By that time it was 3 o'clock in the morning, and Father had to catch a train to New York, and I had to wait the rest of the day because I had to catch the Michigan Central up to Toronto, and then the Canadian National to the Grand Trunk Pacific was at that time, to Montreal.
You're on.
We are starting a continuation
Oh,
of
but maybe you're not on. Oh, yes, you are. I've got
the
green.
discussion of the life of Edward Donald Lynch, and at the request of my 3 daughters. First of all, I want to go back and give a little history as to how Helen Mitchell Donald met Patrick Joseph Lynch. Helen came out to visit her uncle, George Donald, in Yakima in the year of 1909 or 10, I'm not definitely sure. At that particular time, Yakima City was quite an area of social life, as well as knowing that there were lots of bars and brothels, and since it was in the center part of the state, it was a highly used area of recreation. The higher class individuals, including my Uncle George, who was the president of one of the banks, and A.E. Larson, who built the A.E. Larson building, and Mr. Miller, who owned and built the Miller building, were all great friends, and they used to have many parties. My grand uncle, George Donald, was very apt in entertaining many people from various parts of the world in their travels. Helen met Pat at one of the social meetings. What actually happened, I'm not sure, but they became friends, and then my father was in pursuit of her in marriage. She was Presbyterian, and he was from a Catholic family. Apparently it made some imprint upon the Lynch family, and grandmother Lynch did make arrangements later on for their marriage in September of 1911 in Buffalo, New York. At her request in a written statement to the Archbishop of Buffalo, she said that she was willing to have her youngest and only son, who was not married, be released to marry a Presbyterian at that particular time. It was an unusual wedding. My father had courted my mother directly and indirectly by his tours back to Montreal to sell hops in the late fall, and struck up an acquaintance with the Donald family and many of their relatives at that time. Apparently my father was very popular with my grandmother, as they were both of Irish extraction, and entertained each other with lots of stories and anecdotes.
Dad, why were they married in Buffalo?
They were married in Buffalo because since she was a Canadian citizen, in order to make her an American citizen by marriage, they had to be married in the United States.
Oh.
Much to the consternation of my maternal grandfather, Ed Donald, He felt that that was a travesty on his British ancestry, since he was from a Scotch family.
Now, sorry to interrupt
Yes.
again. Had Grandma finished university
Oh
at
yes,
that point?
she had graduated in 1906 or 7 as an honor student, and she wanted to enter the field of or business field, but my grandfather put his firm foot down, saying no, that she was above doing that type of work, and that she spent a good deal of her time going from one place to the next and traveling with her mother, who had as many railroad passes to fill a book that she used very extensively. So they went from various places to various places until she decided that she would come west to see what was going on in the west, and that's how she became a visitor of my Uncle George in the year either 1909 or 1910. They had just the one son, who was myself, who was born in the 13th of July 1912. They became great golfing people. I started playing golf at the country club at the age of 8 with the tutorage of a professional, a Scotsman. We always made the country club part of the art of living. Most weekends, my father would be a golfer. He was a switch person. He could swing a golf club left or right, and he frequently did, particularly if he got in trees and he had to have a left-handed club. I was indoctrinated as a caddy in the early days, much to my consternation and rebellion, but he prevailed.
Yeah.
So that more or less fills in the gaps of the early days of my childhood as well as my parents. So we will now go on to what I did following graduation from McGill University Medical Faculty in
Dad,
1939.
Can I come in?
Yes.
And just talk about, as a child, did you travel places?
Oh yes,
And
I've traveled many places. We of course went through the routine when we closed up house in Yakima and went to Southern California, and we did a lot of traveling in those days throughout Southern California on the weekend. After we returned to Yakima in 1921, my father bought a new Chandler Fayette car and had it equipped with trunks, and we left Yakima in June and went by car from Yakima through the northern part of Idaho into British Columbia, then into Alberta, and to Saskatchewan, and finally ended up in the town of Portage-la-Prairie, where Aunt Jean, mother's sister, and her husband Guy Bell were residing in a very beautiful home. He was the local manager of the Bank of Montreal. We did go to Edmonton, and also we ended several tours into Winnipeg on that summer, and then returned by car to Yakima in the end of August and first part of September, so I could go to school again. That was quite a trip. There were not many good roads. Many times we would end up in Farmer Brown's backyard. We got into several hail and tornado storms, and we had to be pulled out of mud holes by farmers who had the heavy teams to do the same. I also traveled as a child with my grandfather back and forth across Canada, and with my mother on several occasions. My first tour to Montreal was in the winter of 1918. We had Christmas in Montreal. It was very cold. The snow was extremely high. I got stuck in snow in the backyard of their home on Dorchester Street. I remember the address was 7274 Dorchester Avenue in Westmount, which was a part of Montreal proper. I also traveled to New York on several occasions, to Winnipeg on numerous occasions with my mother to visit Aunt Jean and Uncle Guy when he was transferred to a place called Weyburn out in the prairies of Saskatchewan, where we witnessed several thunder and hurricane or tornado storms. We traveled on several occasions into Vancouver and Victoria, where my father was a advocate of playing golf for every time he could find a golf course. So I saw a lot of country. We also went to the beach on several occasions, the Washington Beach, but never to the Oregon beaches because they were not in production at that time. They had not started building hotels and so forth there. Are there any other questions, Valerie, that you want?
How long did it take, say, to drive from Yakima to Seattle, and how'd you get there?
Well, we drove over the Snoqualmie Pass, going up through the Snake River Canyon into Elmsburg from Yakima, and from Elmsburg into Cle Elum, and then through the pass. It was all a two-way highway, one road going west and one going east. There were a number of bridges and many areas in which you forded the creeks that hadn't had any culverts and put across to channel the water underneath the roads. It would take us approximately 5 or 6 hours, a good time. We would usually take a picnic lunch along and stop along some stream and have lunch before we got there. We would go to Lake Washington and then take the ferry across to the foot of Yesler Way and go up along the skid roads that they brought the lumber from, or the actual trees from across Lake Washington into the Yesler Way mill factories that were down on the Puget Sound. We stayed most of the time at the old Stewart Hotel, which was on 2nd Avenue and Pine. It was right across from the New Washington, which was the elite hotel in those days, and just on the edge of the Denny Regrade, which was being constructed at that time. The Denny Regrade was a fabulous early day removing of a large mountain in the center of Seattle. It took I don't know how many years to do. There's lots of programming and pictures and literature on that particular time of moving the actual Denny Regrade mountain into the lower areas of the Puget Sound, where they built many dikes and made the area an industrial park. We also went to Tacoma on several occasions and witnessed several exhibitions and this type of thing. So as a youngster, I was privileged to travel a good deal, although many times my family would leave me with various members of the family in the farms, and I learned to ride horses and how to take care of cattle and this type of thing as a youngster before I went to work at the age of 10.
It sounds both a little lonely as well as interesting.
I spent many hours alone at home. I became an avid reader, not only reading history books, but the encyclopedias. I had the Wonder Book of Knowledge, which I combed through from stem to stern. I think there were 18 volumes, or inch and a half thick, I had nothing else to do. I had no playmates particularly, except when I went to school. And when I was in Post Hilton camp, which was up the Natchez at Gold Creek, and there I spent many happy hours with a number of my younger people. There were 8 families that made up the Post Hilton Illicky camp, and had a large cabin, and we all each had their separate family tents or cabins in the area of 5 acres. That project is still present, and several of the youngsters now in my age come up every summer from Southern California, like the Dunbars, and live there all summer long, and have for several years. Any other questions to go back to?
No, that's okay. I'm glad you brought up the camp.
Yeah.
That's a neat place.
Yes, there were, it was a lot of fun there. We had lots of hiking and building of lean-tos and secret places in the forest, and we did some fishing. Once in a while we'd run into a wildcat when it was young, and that type of thing. So we learned a lot about nature. The pack rats would come, and I shot a lot of holes in my tent with my .22 rifle trying to hit them. I don't think I was very successful, but at least it scared them all. Now, if we may, we'll proceed to what I did following graduation from medical school. I took on a 2-year program of being assistant and then chief resident in the second year at Providence Medical Center in Seattle. It was to be one of the teaching hospitals in the idea of starting a medical school associated with the University of Washington. They were interesting times because the academicians that were brought in and the people, the physicians and surgeons who were doing the practice of medicine in the Seattle area had rather stormy times before it was finally decided that the academicians would run the medical school and would then appoint and hire professors of surgery, medicine, and so forth. I, at that time, my first year there, got mononucleosis. It was one of the first cases of mononucleosis on the West Coast. I spent nearly a month in hospital running temperatures 103, 4, and 5 about every 8 hours. No one knew the diagnosis. In fact, Dr. James Bauer, with the insistence of my first cousin, Dr. Herbert Lynch, to become a consultant. He had recently read an article in one of the medical journals about a Paul Bennell test, which was indicative of the interest of a viral retrovirus disease we now know of mononucleosis. And I recovered. It took me 3 months. I didn't go back to work at Providence until the first of the year. And that was in 1940.
Did you live at the hospital?
Oh yes, we lived at the hospital. I had several interns under my control while I was in the hospital. I took over as senior surgical resident in June of 1940. And my buddy, who I still contact, Dr. Dwight Danberg, was to take over the medicine side, but he developed tuberculosis that the first week that we started and was hospitalized in a sanitarium, so it became my job to be not only surgical chief but medical chief. It kept me pretty busy. I had 11 interns. I had previous many people coming in as assistant residents who would last only 2 or 3 months and would go on because of the job was a 24-hour job and they just didn't want to spend that much time. Finally, towards the end of my second year, the sister superior of the hospital brought me in one day, and I thought maybe I was going to be fired, but she said, "From now on, doctor, you'll get every second weekend off, and Friday night until 6 o'clock Monday morning, you will get a raise in pay." And I was the highest paid resident in any of the hospitals in Seattle. I got the magnificent sum of $90 a month with board and room. So that was a very interesting time. I then had qualified to become a resident and research fellow for the Mayo Brothers by passing their examinations, and had signed a contract to get $1,000 a year plus board and room and certain medical privileges with that contract. When it was returned to me, a printed contract, and the bottom of it was a typewritten note saying, if you are a reserve medical officer, please do not sign but return the contract. And I had joined Base Hospital 50 in my first year there, because everybody knew that sooner or later the United States would be involved in the war in Europe. Therefore, I had to return the printed contract to Mayo's, and I was then forced to go into active practice. My father and I had gone to Montana to look at some mining property in August, and we were called back because Uncle Con had gotten into some difficulty with an accident in one of his exploits into the wilderness where he owned a cabin, and he was operated on, and he subsequently passed away 3 or 4 days later with an acute blood reaction, and that was before the medical profession knew anything about the Rh factor, and he had been sensitized by taking a previous blood transfusion some years before, and when they transfused him after his surgery from the accident that he had, he went into an acute, what we call a delayed allergic response, and passed away. I took over his practice until I was called into active duty on just the time of the Japanese attack on Honolulu.
And Dad, why didn't Herb take over?
Well, he had his own practice, so I practiced with him in the joint office on the Larson building on the 7th floor. Until I was called into active duty. I developed or contacted months, because I spent a good deal of my waking hours looking after welfare cases at that time. As my mother said, why do you have an office? Because you don't do very much in your office, maybe 5 or 6 patients a day, but from about 9 or 10 in the evening, you're gone all night long. I was living at home with my parents, and I was in and out during the night, answering the bells of the telephone for assistance at the hospitals or making house calls, particularly on welfare cases.
Was the Larson building a medical building?
Well, no, there were a lot of medical offices in the building, as well as insurance offices and accountants and this type of business. It was a very active place. It was the largest building in town. I had to spend 3 weeks flat on my back before I could go to McCord Air Force Base and report for duty in the first part of February 1942. I was shipped immediately to the East Coast, and strangely enough, through my experiences as a surgical resident, I had testified against a doctor who claimed he was a cosmetic surgeon. He'd gotten into a great deal of difficulty with a patient, and since I was in charge of this type of thing, I was called by the sister in charge of the surgical unit at Providence Hospital to try to save this person, which we did. We had to clamp off lots of vessels and so forth, and I had to appear before the surgical board of the hospital and say that this person was not qualified to do what he was attempting to do. And so when I arrived at McCord Air Force Base to start my duties, who was I assigned to in the division but this man who had been a reserve officer, and instead of being a rank of mine, which was first lieutenant, he was a major in charge of the medical detachment of the regiment, which we were all shipped across country on a troop train to Florence, South Carolina. I had 27 changes of station in 18 days. He made my life miserable. However, it did me some good because I finally became a medical officer for the first contingency of the 8th Air Force and did most of the examining of the 50 pilots and their crews that went to establish headquarters in London during the Battle of Britain. I was supposed to go with them as a medical officer, but I hadn't been in the service long enough to go through medical Air Force training as a flight surgeon. I did fly from Savannah, Georgia, in Hunter Field to Boston in a DB-7, or what we now know as an A-20A attack bomber, with a very good friend of mine, Lieutenant Galou, who turned out to be the chief pilot for Lieutenant General Vandenberg. We stopped and had dinner at Washington, D.C., where all the presidents embark on planes. We went to the Officers Club and had a very nice dinner. We left there in the darkness and cleared our station, and that's the last our radio was able to contact us. We flew over New York, not realizing that we had no radio contact, and we were buzzed by fighter planes because we were thought to be a foreign airplane because it was a British plane and had British markings on it. We landed in Boston and were brought immediately to the commanding officer's office at the airport. He was a full colonel, and we got a thorough redressing down, and of course Lieutenant Galou, who was a pilot, was told that he was grounded until such time that his plane was put back in service. We had to wait there for 2 days until they found out that the plane's radio was out and had been repaired. That was my first view of from an airplane of New York City. I was in the nose of the plane, the bombardier seat, and I was able to read the Washington newspaper that I picked up in Washington, D.C. by the lights of the searchlights that were guarding that city. So it was a rather interesting trip. I returned to my base in Florence, South Carolina after that, and then was shipped to Tampa, Florida, and I spent a few months there training for overseas duty in the Far East. I was attached to a ranger outfit, and we would walk for many miles a day in the heat during August, and then I was shipped from there to Boston and then loaded on a British cruise ship, and we started out for the European theater of operation, not knowing exactly where we were going. We stopped at Halifax in the middle of the night and picked up in our convoy 5 Canadian vessels loaded with troops. We had 2 or 3 battleships with us and several cruisers, a number